Hello, everyone. It is a CCO student webinar. We're on number 64. See how the time flies when you're having fun? Tonight, we're going to talk about endocrinology, and I think it's exciting to talk about risk adjustment. You know, that's one of my favorite things to talk about. So I picked to start with kind of in a student's focusing on specific specialties, and we're going to talk about some of the diagnoses that carry HCCs. This is going to be beneficial both for, well, it'll be beneficial for all the credentials that we work with. However, I'm going to highlight some information on risk adjustment. And after we do endocrinology, I think we'll do some other specialties as well. So let's just jump right in. When we look at endocrinology, there is some ICD codes that carry HCCs that you need to be well aware of. You don't need to have these memorized. However, it will make you faster and more accurate if you pay attention to these particular I only picked a few because they're just so common. Now, of course, when we talk about endocrinology, we think of diabetes. And another reason I really like endocrinology is because it covers every single body system. Whenever a person has diabetes, there are comorbidities, there are side effects, the signs and symptoms. They affect every body system. In fact, I don't think there's any other specialty that affects every body system like endocrinology. You may, if you think of one, then let me know. But having spent the last year looking at all the specialties from oncology, cardiology, even dermatology, podiatry, all of these, none of them touch every body system with the in-depth amount that endocrinology does. And I talked to an endocrinologist the other day, and he specifically said, and that's why I love endocrinology. So let's get into diabetes. We're going to kind of do an overview. That means that you get your pen and paper out and make little notes so that if I say something that sparks the little gray cells, you think to yourself, okay, I'm going to make a note of that and I'm going to go do some further research on my own. I don't want to just be feeding you the information. I want to spur you to increase your knowledge base on your own. First, starting with diabetes, the main two codes that we deal with is type 1 and type 2 diabetes, which is E10.9 and E11.9. If you don't have those memorized, you probably will within a short time if you're new to coding, because they are so common. E11.9 being the most common, and it is the default code for diabetes if diabetes is not documented by the provider as to what type. And the reason is 98% of all diabetics are type 2. So it's not even a 50-50% guess. It's a 98 to 2%, right? One thing to remember about type 1 diabetes is that person does take insulin. They don't produce insulin in their body. They were born that way. Now, some people say, well, that's juvenile diabetes. Well, in the past, they did call it that, but they got away from that some time ago because you could be a little bit older and find out that you had type 1 diabetes. It's the fact that your body doesn't produce insulin. That makes you an E10.9 or type 1 diabetic. Type 2 diabetes means you're insulin resistant, or you still produce insulin, but it's really, really low, okay? And again, it's the most common form of diabetes. I got that on my face. Documentation, when you're looking for documentation on the diabetes, some verbiage that stands out that's pretty common is going to be statements like stable disease with patient's diabetes metrics meeting goals. right? So they've acknowledged that the patient has diabetes and they're on track. And that doesn't mean that they're type 1 or type 2. That's just stating everything's looking good right now. Or you might see a statement like no presence of active diabetic complications, including hyperglycemia. Now, hyperglycemia is when, the blood sugar shoots up really high because we don't have insulin to compensate for that. And that can be a common complication of diabetes, whether you're type 1 or type 2. Just so you know, another code that you need to be aware of, and I would write this down if this is one you're not familiar with, is Z79.4. That's the code for long-term insulin use. For risk adjustment, if your patient's an E11.9, type 2 diabetic, and they are taking insulin, you want to also capture Z79.4. Go to the med list and you'll see one of the insulins listed. If you're not real familiar with insulin names, go to how much the patient's getting. It will say units. Whenever you see something in units, it's usually insulin or some type of injectable, but almost all the time it's insulin. It won't take you long to learn the different types of insulin. Now, there is an insulin pen. However, a lot of the times if you're not familiar with them and they say pen, you want to go and look and make sure it's actually an insulin pen and not a diabetic pen, because there's other medications now that they give in a pen form, meaning it looks like a pen, but it has the medication preloaded and then you just inject it. If that's the case, the patient might not be on insulin. It is a medication that kind of helps the body's ability to work with the levels of insulin that it's producing. And so that is not long-term insulin use. They might be on metformin and stuff. Very seldom will you have a patient that's on a oral glucose medication as well as insulin. It does happen, but not often. So if you see that they're on glucophage or metformin, then they probably are not taking insulin, but they could be using a pen. Now, insulin also comes in a pen, a preloaded pen, and they can dial in how much insulin they give themselves, and then it's used specific number of times. Okay, so again, if you're not familiar with that, you need to take some time to study and become more familiar with it and learn the different types of insulin. I found several little funny cartoons, and I hope you enjoy them as we go through. I'm not going to read them. They'll be there for your enjoyment. If you're in the the CP, I almost say everything wrong, CCO club, you'll have access to this slide deck and you'll be able to print it off or use it however you need to study, as well as getting a transcript of our conversation and carry on a conversation about what we talked about, one of the perks of being in the club. If a patient has hyperglycemia with their diabetes, that means that their blood sugar has shot up very, very high. This could be anywhere from 300, up. There was one person that I knew that she would run in the 500s, and she was running in the 500s for a very long time. And usually people get up in those numbers, and they start having other complications. So they did finally get hers stabilized. However, she was diabetes with hyperglycemia for some time, and that affects the rest of the organs in the body. So you don't want to run at a high sugar level too long. Documentation that you're probably going to see whenever a person has diabetes and they're running with hyperglycemia is terms like their A1Cs not at goal, glucose readings above goal, increase in medication and treatment regime to gain better blood sugar control, and then you could either see other stuff commenting on the hyperglycemia. Because again, we don't want the patients to be running at a high level for very long. It damages the organs. The codes that you're going to use for this, if a patient is having hyperglycemia, you would use E11.65, okay? And that is an other complication, is what the 0.65. But you're not going to use E11.9 with that code. If you have comorbidities or complications with your diabetes, you're not going to use E11.9. You're going to use, you can use multiple diabetic codes, but E11.9 is not one of those, because E11.9 means everything's going smoothly. So that is not the proper code to use. But you can have an E11.4, a 2, a 5. All of those signify, everything after the decimal signifies what body system is being affected ultimately. Another note, that the verbiage of a patient being under or uncontrolled and poorly controlled, that doesn't mean the same thing. So you want to pay attention to the documentation and in its entirety, all right? So don't just look at uncontrolled and assume which code it's going to be. What's going on? Make sure that you have a complete picture. Uncontrolled could mean that your patient has hyperglycemia, but it could also be hypoglycemia, and that would change the code. So I'm not going to do the type, when I read these off, I'm not going to use both the type 1 and type 2 diabetes. I'm just going to go with the type 2 code going forward. So if your patient has hyperglycemia, it's going to be E1165, but if they have hypoglycemia, it's going to be E11.649. And again, you can find this in the index, but all those codes are real close to each other in the tabular, so you'll be able to look at them. Don't get that confused with poorly controlled. That means hyperglycemia, and that would be an E11.65. Right, so that's why you have to read all of the documentation to make sure you're capturing the proper code. Providers don't always know the difference in the code that they pick. The verbiage isn't always there for them to explain. It's our job to translate, and that's why we look at all of the documentation to make sure we have context, that we're getting the proper code at the higher specificity. If we're in doubt, we query the provider and ask them if it's uncontrolled or poorly controlled with hyperglycemia. Other complications that are very common is kidney complications. We have CKD, which I'm going to bring up again in a slide in just a moment. E11.2 is going to have, will deal with renal complications with the kidneys. And we have neurological complications, which is E11.4. Now, this could be things like neuropathy. That's going to be your more common polyneuropathy. E11.5 is circulatory complications, and E11.6 is other specified complications, and that's why 0.65 falls under hyperglycemia, right? And hypoglycemia. But note, all of these end in a 9, and they are for other complications. When we use the term other, that means there is a definition, we have specificity, the provider has documented it. However, we don't have a code for it at this time. So we use the term other. This is different than unspecified. Unspecified means we don't have the specificity at this time, and that could be because the provider is waiting for further testing to be done. They still haven't determined the specificity or where the complication is at. And so there is a need for unspecified as well as other. These all carry an HCC at a higher level than E11.9. E11.9 carries an HCC of 19. But if we have E11.2 or 4, 5, 6, that will be a 18, as well as Z79.4, long-term insulin use, carries a 9 or 18. And so that bumps that RAF score up. In addition, we have an example of hypertension associated with diabetes. Now, I see this a lot in charts, and you have a patient that has diabetes and a patient that has hypertension. However, there's no linkage. So I can't code E11.59 without the provider telling me specifically that the hypertension is associated to diabetes, because there is no causal relationship there. Maybe the provider isn't aware that there is a code that joins those two together. Then I would educate on that and say, your patient has hypertension and type 2 diabetes and these this verbiage that we're seeing, the target A1C less than 8.0, refer to diabetic educator, target blood pressure less than 130/80, and they're on medications like hydralazine, metoprolol, or Lasix, then I could say there is a code for hypertension associated to diabetes. If this is applicable, the code is, and then they would know that going forward. That's not the same as a query. That would be like educating your provider, letting them know that if you're querying, you can't lead the provider, so you would state, the code E11.59, type 2 diabetes with circulatory complications, is equivalent to hypertension associated with diabetes, or E11.9 and I10 is them being separate. And then the provider can choose for you. It does change the RAF score and the score for the patient for it to be an E11.59, which is an 18, versus E11.9, which is a 19. Other presumed relationships with diabetes, this is different. This is not the same as what we just spoke about. We don't have to have linkage with these diagnoses. There's like 50 presumed relationship diagnoses that are in your ICD manual. And we know that because of the indent. And we've talked about this in other videos, so I'm not going to go into depth about how you know that it is a presumed relationship or causal relationship with diabetes, but it has to do with the indent. And just picked out some of the main ones that are very, very common. As we said, diabetes affects all body systems. And I think it was 2017, the rules changed, the guidelines changed. In the past, if we had diabetes and polyneuropathy, there wasn't, the provider didn't link it. It had to state diabetes with polyneuropathy. But now, since 2017, that causal relationship is assumed. It's presumed, not assumed. So when you have a patient with diabetes and you have and that patient also has polyneuropathy or neuropathy, then you use the diabetic E11.4 code, because that's a neurological complication. and it might be E11.45, E11.49, but it's a 4 because it's neurological. The other ones that are, again, really common are autonomic polyneuropathy, hyperglycemia, which again we mentioned before, polyneuropathy, hypoglycemia, mononeuropathy, all of those are neurological, periodontal disease, again, so common with your diabetics, chronic kidney disease, peripheral vascular disease, foot ulcers, retinopathy, skin ulcers, neuropathy, nephropathy, and Charcot's joints. These are just a few of the 50 that you'll know are presumed relationships with diabetes, carries the higher HCC. All of these will be at an 18, at least an 18. And then there are some of them, and I can't remember, I don't have them memorized, they actually carry a 17. And if you're new to risk adjustment, don't assume because the HCC score is lower, that doesn't always indicate a higher level of disease or illness. It's just the way the numbers flow sometimes. It's like when I tell people that when you look at codes and an 8 usually indicates other and a 9 is usually unspecified, but we just saw that slide where the 9 ended in 9 and all those were others instead. So most of the time that rings true after the point or the decimal. If it's an 8, it's other, and 9 unspecified, or the way the code ends. But just when you say that, then you come across a code that is the exceptions to the rule. Just to reiterate again, and I think this is like the 6th time I've said it, diabetes affects all body systems. It even affects the skin. The skin is where you get skin ulcers, but you can have dryness and itchiness of the skin as well as breakouts and things. So keep in mind when you see something, and if you suspect it has that relationship with the diabetes, you need to inquire or read more documentation to clarify for yourself. Sometimes you have diabetes that needs to be coded with additional codes. Now, it was wonderful when ICD-10 came out, because in the past we had to use multiple codes describing everything in ICD-9, and then you got things like diabetes with polyneuropathy is one code. But there's always, as we said, an exception to the rule, and it usually indicates things like stages. What do we stage? CKD, and we also stage ulcers. So you'll always be using multiple codes when dealing with chronic kidney disease or any type of skin ulcer. There isn't a combo code for those. E11.2 is type 2 diabetes with a renal or some type of nephrology associated disease that a nephrologist would be following. CKD has stages, and it's really easy because the N18 after the decimal, that follows the stage. So CKD1 is N18.1, and so on and so forth, till you get down to end-stage renal disease. I have to note, though, for 2021, stage 3, which is kind of the most common that you're going to end up seeing, N18.3 has additional characters now. None of the others have additional characters, so they'll have 4 characters, except for N18.3, stage 3, now has an O for CKD3A and a 1 for CKD stage 3B. So it would read N18.30 and N18.31. It is not up to you to determine whether it's an A or B. And we need to give the education to the provider, letting them know that there is another character in the N18.3 or CKD3 code, or they won't document that. And it has to do with the GFR, the level, and we aren't allowed to look at the labs and make determinations. Just like trying to decide if your patient is diabetic, we can't say, well, this patient has a glucose level of 325. They're diabetic. No, that's not our job to do that. And if they're not diabetic, then we better figure out why they're not coded diabetes. Maybe there's been an injury or something. But again, we're there to just translate and write into another language, into the code set. Okay, so be aware of N18.3 has an additional character, and your provider may not be educated on that right now. However, when you have an E11.2 code, it does risk adjust at an 18 versus a 19. So it makes a difference. And then you also get a score. N18 carries an HCC. I just don't remember what it is at the top of my head. It's not 55, but I can't remember. I think that's heart stuff. In addition, you could end up using a third code, if applicable. If you have a patient that is N18.5, stage 5 renal disease, and they start taking dialysis treatments, they're no longer an N18.5, they turn into an N18.6 at that point. Once they start dialysis, they now have end-stage renal disease. With that code, you would append also Z99.2 because that has an HCC. You want to capture that. Then you may, in addition, from time to time, have a patient who is non-compliant with renal dialysis. Then you could append also Z91.15. All pertinent for tracking statistically and telling the story of the patient, giving the proper translation. As we look at skin complications, we might have an additional code that describes the ulcer. And there's a pretty large range of these codes because it has several body areas that are covered. Okay, so you have your lower extremities, your upper extremities, you have your torso, you have the head and neck. All of these have areas. You have the buttocks, and like front and back type determinations, but you also have laterality for, if you have a foot ulcer of the right foot, and then they can say, well, is it on the heel of the foot, right? Plantar part of the foot, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very, very specific as to where the ulcer is. So you'll notice the code range for the ulcers, L97, and these are non-pressure ulcers, foot ulcers that are diabetic ulcers. L97 is where you're going to be looking, but you're going to go from 3.301 to 0.529. That's a lot of codes, and that is just for ankle, heel, and midfoot. And then look down at other, and you've got 0.801 through 0.929, non-pressure ulcer of the lower leg. You could have multiple pressure ulcers. So you would code once E11.621, and you could have a pressure ulcer on both feet. So you could have laterality in there. But what if you had a pressure ulcer of the foot, and then you had a pressure ulcer of the lower leg, then you had a one on the buttocks, one you had on the elbows, and they get them on the ears and the back of the head. So again, it can get really diverse. You want to pay close attention to that because it changes the RAF score. the HCCs. Moving on from diabetes, we're still going to be talking about endocrinology, and we're going to talk about hyperpituitarism. This is an area where we see a lot of, it's not as common as diabetes, but we still see it a lot. I think we see hypo more than hyper, but we'll talk about that also. The signs and symptoms, I went ahead and put these in there for you because you're going to see them in the documentation. The big ones that you should be aware of is anything that happens with the eyes, excessive sweating, the decreased libido, lethargy, headache, muscle weakness, and bruising. That's very, very common. I see that in the documentation a lot. And they are the symptoms of hyperpituitarism, but what signs and symptoms that you get really are associated with what type of hyperpituitarism or condition the patient has. So you could have Cushing syndrome. Now this one is actually, I see that documented quite a lot. You could just have hyperpituitarism, nothing else. You could have gigantism or acromegaly, which is the example, the little graphic that I pulled out. Do you remember Jaws from the James Bond movies, the older James Bond movies? He had acromegaly, the character that played Jaws. And there's a definition of the chin is more squared, but ultimately the person grows and they don't stop. And unless they go in and take care of the, I think it's the pituitary gland or whatever gland is being affected. Thus, it's endocrinology because that's glands. Then let's see, hyperfunction of pituitary gland. The codes that you're going to be aware of is E22. And these that we already mentioned, the acromegaly and pituitary giantism is 0.0. You have hyperprolactinemia, 0.1. 0.8 is other hyperfunction of pituitary gland. And this could be central precocious pituitary. And 0.9 is unspecified. And then 0.0 Cushing syndrome. Okay, so if you're not familiar with any of these, I would tell you to take some time, look them up, so like Cushing syndrome, and find out what the signs and symptoms are, the common signs and symptoms, so that you can see that in the documentation. Hypopituitarism is going to be again, if I see it, I tend to see this more often, and it's the hypofunction or the low function of the pituitary gland. This is it's E23. 0.1, drug-induced hypopituitarism. So they're taking medication that has affected the pituitary gland, which has lowered the production of the hormone. You can have diabetes insipidus, which is 0.2, 0.3, hypothalamic dysfunction, and 0.6, other, and 0.7 is unspecified. Disorders, other disorders, and again, what does other stand for? We don't have a code for it at this time. So they have specificity. E27 means other disorders of the adrenal gland. They don't have their own kind of parent code. Well, you're going to see things like the 0.0 other adrenal cortical overactivity. I'm not going to read all of these for you, but I do want to mention Addison's crisis, Addison's disease. Absolutely one that if you're not familiar with, you need to look up. It's going to help you because it's a horror. It's like Cushing's and Addison's are very similar to each other, but pretty miserable type diseases. And then let's look down at the 0.8 other specified disorders and 9 disorders of adrenal gland unspecified. So they're still doing testing. In the red box, we have the common signs and symptoms for hyperpituitarism and hypopituitarism. Hyperpituitarism just kind of speeds the body up. and everything. That's why you get that acromegaly, where the cells, they just keep growing, and the hormone is feeding, telling these cells to grow. Whereas you have the opposite with hypo, where everything slows down. Morbid obesity. I think you're going to find that this affects all of the specialties that you might be involved in risk adjustment. It's been an area where we have captured for MIPS and statistical purposes for a long time, trying to track it. Therefore, now some of the guidelines, they've established some better guidelines, I think, for us. But morbid obesity risk adjusts, and obesity is classified with risk adjustment as a BMI of 40 or above. So if you have a BMI documented, which is really common, the nurse or the clinician usually documents that when you take the patient's vital signs and then you weigh them and they do the height, the BMI is documented by the clinician. And that is usually up there with the vital signs, wherever the vital signs are at. Now, you can, if it's below 40, it doesn't carry an HCC. That you need to have memorized, that it doesn't. If the patient has morbid obesity as a documented condition, you can code for the E6601. However, you're going to have a conflict if the patient has a BMI of, say, 35. Okay, so that's going to be a problem in risk adjustment. But if you have that BMI of 40 or above and you don't have the diagnosis of morbid obesity, then you can't capture that for risk adjustment. It has to be linked together. So you can have morbid obesity by itself without a BMI, but you can't have the BMI of 40 above and not have morbid obesity also documented. It's just a guideline. So anything over Z68.41 is going to risk adjust. And it risk adjusts the same as E66.01, which is morbid obesity. If your provider documents that the patient has morbid obesity and there's not a BMI, then it's morbid obesity and you don't question that. If the patient has a BMI of 35 and they state morbid obesity, then it's, by their terms, it's morbid obesity. However, it doesn't apply for risk adjustment when you have to carry the HCC. Okay, so just be very, very careful with that. Usually, you'll find that they capture that BMI just 1 or 2 times a year. Now, I have found in the charts that I've looked at, they do it every single time the patient comes in, but the provider doesn't sometimes change the code. So they'll say that they have morbid obesity, but they've been on a diet and exercise program and they've lost 30 pounds, and they'll document they lost 30 pounds. So their BMI isn't the same as it was. So they'll say they're at a Z68.41, but the BMI is actually at like a 32. And so then you need to query the provider and let them be aware that that code is no longer accurate. Now, this happens when the providers are picking the codes. In the past, the providers didn't pick the codes. We coded for them. But now they're picking the code, and so we need to go in and either educate or query and let them know that, you documented that the patient lost weight and their BMI is at a specific stage now. And you'll often find they do remark on the patient's weight loss, which is great. So it's all linked and everything. They just pulled the wrong code. Abnormal BMIs can they want to make sure that your provider is always documented weight-related diagnoses and then other issues or conditions related to the patient's weight. Now, I like to also mention, and you want to let your providers know, that when your patient gets a BMI that is below 19 or 18.5 and they're underweight, if you see that, that doesn't risk adjust. Only 40 and above risk adjust. However, if there's documentation that the patient has malnutrition, that does risk adjust. So red flag, whenever you see a really, really low BMI, make sure that that's something you're looking for. Does the patient have malnutrition? And so that you can capture that risk adjustment score. And I think we're wrapping up then. That's it. Wow, we went through that so fast. And I think it's because I absolutely love this. Let me just look to see if we have any questions. Jane. Jane was there yesterday at our student. We have every Wednesday, almost every Wednesday, we have a student kind of like open house, house calls, or that's not house call. I can't remember what we call it, student call. And so all of our students can join and we talk for an hour and just kind of go over what they're doing. But we talked about these codes quite a bit yesterday. So yes, Jane's getting ready to test. Can you code E6 3.8 and E63 can you use for diet symptoms? Well, I have to pull that code. Let me just pull it up real quick and see if I can get that because I don't have E63 memorized. So let me just sign in to my find a code and we'll look real quick. Let me move that over. Oh, got that already memorized. So let's clean that. E. You said C 3.0. Essential fatty acid deficiency. So the question was, can you code E638 and E63? Okay. So let's see if it says we can't, because sometimes it'll tell you, don't code these together. So this is a specific type of deficiency. And let's go look real quick at E63.8, other specified nutritional deficiency. Yeah, you can code those together. You could, it's just like diabetes. You could have multiple types of comorbidities with diabetes. So other stands for, there isn't a code for it yet, so it could be applicable to do both. So E40 for children only. Let me just go look. I don't have that one memorized. I don't think that's a child only. Okay, so what I'm seeing, poor nutrition, mild. There is nothing stating that this is children. It's probably more common in children. So, and diagnosis E41, let's go look. There's nothing saying that it's exclusive to, now do look, if it's an intestinal, if they find out, you know, then it, but E64 is sequela of protein, calorie, malnutrition, you know, late effect. And the other code you said 41. Okay. Can you have both? Now these carry HCCs. Okay, this is different because this has marasmus, and that is, I don't know what that is. I can't remember. Ooh, Jane, you're making me think. Oh, wait, look, both of these are very serious condition forms of severe acute malnutrition, which are rarely diagnosed in the U.S. Okay, so let's just take this word and find out what that means more specifically. This is kind of how we do research on those. Yeah. Form of severe malnutrition and energy deficiency. It can occur in anyone, there you go, with severe malnutrition, but usually occurs in children. There's your answer, Jane. It can be adults. Body weight is reduced to less than 62%, but I don't think, what is the between is frequently blurred as many children present with features of both. So they are different. This is a good, let me just copy that link. Let's see if I can, am I able to put that in the chat? I don't know. I don't know if I can put it in the chat for you. Oh wait, let me go over here to private chat, this new platform. Let me paste that link. Nope, that didn't do it. I'm sorry, as I'm learning as we go. Let me just get this link again. Copy link address. Paste. I don't know if that, who that went to though. Jesus, there, Jesus got it up. There, or it was delayed. Let's see. BMI for kids and children now? No, there isn't a specific that I know of. Now there may be a list for a BMI for children, because think about it. If you have a person who is a dwarf, their BMI is not going to be accurate, right? Or you have a patient who is a weightlifter, you know, definitely their BMI is going to be off. We talked about this. Let's see. Whitney said, what BMI can you start coding malnutrition? I believe it is the 18.5 or anything below 19 is the way I've been educating my providers on. Anything below 19. Now, it is not assumed. You cannot state that the patient has a BMI, of 18.5, therefore they suffer from malnutrition. That is not accurate. So again, it has to be documented that the patient has malnutrition. The BMI that low does not risk adjust, but the malnutrition does. And so again, sometimes we're not getting that malnutrition documented by the provider because it's kind of an afterthought. It's in their brain, but it's not necessarily applicable to why the patient came in. And for risk adjustment, we need it documented every time, right? We want to capture that HCC. Let's see. Can I use the 2020 combo? You could, but it wouldn't be wise because there was a lot of changes. However, you can. Now, the reason that we tell you that it's not a good idea, and you didn't specify whether you wanted CPT or with ICD. You could actually maybe get by with ICD more so than CPT. Major changes this year in the E&M system for 2021. So you only get to miss 40 on the CPC exam and still pass. Do you really want to take the chance and have paid out all of that money over the price of the code book, right? So, and if it's a problem, maybe you could share with somebody. Let's see. You're welcome, Jane. Okay, so both CPT, yeah, I really wouldn't chance it. Now I know people that have done it, but again, as an instructor, I would tell you not to do it. You can go in and make notes in your 2021, but again, do you really want to invest? That's like saying, I'm going to go take my driver's test, but I'm going to use my great grandpa's old clunker of a pickup that has bald tires, and I'm not very good with a 5-speed, Could I do it? Yeah, it would pass, but what's your chances that you're going to pass or that's not going to stall or whatever? You know what I mean? Okay. I heard that some CPT documents by docs must put down time and record. Yeah, they do. And we've done a lot of education on this already, Jane, and you're going to be able to go into the club and see that. We may have some YouTube videos still on it as well. If you're in the club and you go back to our February public webinar, the big webinar that we do once a month. In February, we go over all of the changes that were coming in E&M for 2021. So go look for the February edition of the public Q&A webinar. There you go. Jesus, or he's super fast. And that's where you'll be able to learn more about it. They don't document, you get to pick. Just like they could pick 95, 97. Now, if they want to do time-based leveling, they can document the time, but they don't have to. And there's a few little things. If you go back and listen to our CCO live last, Jesus would have to put it up, was Barbara Capozzi. She specifically made some comments about why doing time-based E&M may not always be the best thing for the provider, because you've so take some time to go look at that as well. And then we are getting ready to shoot out our final rule information on the E&M. We go to Maggie Meck, and she is the expert. Laureen and her go back a long way, and she is like top of the line specialist with E&M. She's very busy right now, as you can imagine. And so Laureen said, we're willing to wait. We got so much positive feedback from her education that we provided before that we now have, that if you're in the club, you get access to that. But for 2021, we'll be using her education that she's providing for us exclusively. And so again, wait for that. Right. Well, I'm glad that we kind of wrapped up a little bit earlier so that I can answer your questions. And you know what? I think I lost my slide deck. Did I screw up and lose my slide deck? Nope, there it is. Know that anytime that you have questions, go put them in the CCO club and we will be more than happy to answer them. Jane said, I know with smoking cessation, doctors must list minutes in the record for the patient. Absolutely true. That is a time-based code. We've also done a webinar on time-based codes. I think Jennifer did it for us. One of our specialists, she's super great with billing. However, she's been an instructor for a very long time, and she recently, I don't have in my head, my little gray cells aren't clicking 100% today, when she did that, but she did do, and I believe it was in one of the public webinars, time-based codes, and that's one. Again, I saw documentation on this provider that he was very adamant with wanting to make sure that his patients, if they smoked, that they stopped. And he would document like 2 really in-depth paragraphs on the education that he gave and counseling and stuff, but he would never put the time. And so he never got reimbursed for that. He refused to put the time, and so that code wasn't applicable. It is a time-based code. Without the time documented, it's a no-go. And it ends up being like $25, $35 a patient that he's losing in reimbursement, but that's up to him. Again, Jane just said, oh, sugar, time-based codes be good to see. Well, okay, you want to see that video, but I have to say, I write to a lady who's in Tennessee, and she has the best accent in the world, and she says, oh, sugar, all the time, and it is so cute that I am going to adopt that. And when I saw that, you have got to be from the South. If you're not, you must come from people of the South, Jane. So when we get back together for this, those Wednesday classes, you're going to have to give me your details. or send them in the club. All right, guys, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. We will see you. I guess we're not going to have another live video webinar until after the holidays. And then we'll be back on track. We've got our CPT updates coming, and I look forward to giving those to you. So pay attention. We're going to do that on the 29th. Thank you, Jesus. And that's going to be fun. And again, another reason to see, make sure you attend that. Whoever had asked about can you use the other, the 2020, once you see the updates, that'll give you an idea if you want to take that chance using the older manual. All right, guys. Thank you. And hey, let us know if you like this new format we're using, and Jesus being able to put those comments up. Right. You too. Merry Christmas, guys. I won't say I'll see you next year. We'll see you before then. Bye-bye.